They called him a prodigy. But long before the awards, before the television lights, before the packed arenas that would one day echo with his name, Ricky Skaggs was just a boy from the hills of Kentucky, clutching a mandolin almost too big for his arms. From the outside, his story looked like destiny. A gifted child who rose to fame through sheer talent and charm. But the truth was heavier. Behind every graceful note and polished performance was a lifetime of unseen struggle. The kind of pain that doesn't make the headlines. The kind that hides behind smiles and stage lights. Because what the world never truly saw was how much he had to lose to keep that music alive. They never saw the nights his fingers bled from practice. They never saw the miles of road that separated him from home, or the exhaustion that crept into his voice after too many shows and too little rest. They never saw how loneliness can live, even in the middle of applause. Ricky Skaggs wasn't just born into music. He was born into hardship. The dirt roads of Cordell, Kentucky didn't promise fame. They promised work. And for the Skaggs family, work was survival. But amid that struggle, a sound was born. A sound that carried both the ache of poverty and the peace of faith. A sound that reminded people that beauty can come from broken places. And through that sound, Ricky would one day teach the world that bluegrass wasn't just a genre. It was a form of endurance. Every chord he played was a story. Every lyric, a memory. Every silence between the notes, a prayer whispered in pain. So how did a boy raised in the simplest of homes go on to redefine American country music and do it without losing his soul along the way? It began not on a stage, but in a small wooden house tucked between the hills, where the echoes of gospel hymns mixed with the hum of hard work. It began with faith. It began with struggle. And it began with a mandolin that would soon carry the sound of an entire lifetime. Let's go back to where it all started, to the hills that shaped him, and the hardships that gave his music its soul. Ricky Skaggs was born on July 18, 1954, in Cordell, Kentucky, a small community built on sweat, faith, and the kind of silence that only mountains can hold. The people there didn't have much, but what they lacked in wealth, they made up for in resilience. For families like the Skaggs, each day was a balancing act between work and hope. His father, Hobart, worked wherever he could find a job, in fields, in factories, or sometimes fixing anything that needed mending. His mother, Dorothy, was the steady heart of the home, keeping faith alive through the songs she sang while cooking or cleaning. Their home was humble, but filled with music. Gospel hymns, old mountain ballads, and the laughter of neighbors gathering on front porches when the day's work was done. That's where Ricky first learned what music truly meant. Not as a performance, but as a kind of prayer, a way of surviving. When the world around them felt heavy, the Skaggs family didn't complain. They sang. And young Ricky listened. He listened to the quiver in his mother's voice as she sang of redemption. He listened to his father's foot tapping out the rhythm of endurance. And in that sound, he found something sacred, a connection between pain and peace. When he was just 5, his father brought home a tiny mandolin. The story goes that Ricky begged to play it, and within minutes, he was picking out melodies most adults couldn't manage. But the truth behind that moment isn't just about talent. It's about hunger. Not hunger for fame, but hunger for expression. The kind of hunger that grows when life gives you little else to hold on to. By 6, Ricky was already performing at local churches and community gatherings, standing on wooden boxes so the crowd could see him. His hands were small, but his music carried the weight of something far beyond his years. And though his gift brought smiles to the faces of those around him, it also brought pressure. People began to expect things, to call him special, chosen. But what they didn't know was that behind every performance, there was still a boy trying to make sense of a hard world. That early fame was both blessing and burden. It lifted him out of obscurity, but tied him to an identity before he even understood who he was. And yet, every hardship of his youth, every storm, every empty night carved into his music a kind of raw honesty. He was learning that the most beautiful songs often come from the hardest places. And that understanding would guide him when the world started to take notice. By the time most children were learning multiplication tables, Ricky Skaggs was sharing stages with legends. At just 6 years old, he performed with Bill Monroe, the father of bluegrass, an encounter that would shape the entire course of his life. Monroe saw in the young boy something extraordinary, not just skill, but soul. And while the world saw a child prodigy, what they didn't see was how heavy that gift could feel. Ricky was thrust into a world of adults, stages, spotlights, endless rehearsals. The applause was thunderous, but when the lights dimmed, the silence afterward was louder. He'd return home to that quiet Kentucky night, the echoes of applause still fading, and realize he was still just a boy trying to catch up to the image others had of him. Each success carried its own kind of isolation. The more people celebrated his gift, the more it separated him from ordinary life. While other kids spent their evenings chasing fireflies, Ricky was learning to chase perfection, practicing until his fingers hurt, memorizing songs that told stories of heartbreak he was too young to have lived, but already old enough to understand. His parents were proud, but even they worried. They saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of expectations pressing down. But they also knew music was his calling. It was both his gift and his refuge. As Ricky grew, so did the distance between childhood and the career he was building. By his teenage years, he was performing in clubs, joining professional bands, and traveling from town to town. The crowds loved him, but the road was harsh, endless miles, sleepless nights, and a loneliness that fame never cured. It was in those moments, tired, homesick, and sometimes broke, that Ricky's music deepened. He began to understand that bluegrass wasn't just about technique or tradition. It was about truth. It was about taking the pain of living and turning it into something that could heal. Every performance became an act of endurance, a way to keep going when the world demanded too much. And while the applause felt good, the real reward was something quieter. The knowledge that his music was touching hearts the same way those old mountain hymns once touched his. But the higher he climbed, the more he realized that talent alone wasn't enough. The spotlight could be cold, and success fleeting. And soon, the pressures of the industry would test him in ways far greater than any stage ever could. Because even as Ricky Skaggs rose to fame, life had more lessons in hardship waiting, and the next chapter would demand more than just his music. It would demand his strength. Success, as it turns out, doesn't always feel like winning. For Ricky Skaggs, the dream he'd worked toward since childhood began to feel less like a blessing and more like a test of endurance. The crowds grew, the stages expanded, and the demands never stopped coming. Fame has a way of taking the very thing you love and turning it into the thing that exhausts you. By his late teens, Ricky was fully embedded in the professional music world, touring with Ralph Stanley and the Clinch Mountain Boys. It was a milestone that most bluegrass musicians could only dream of. But behind the applause was a life that never slowed down. Each performance meant another long drive, another night away from home, another promise to meet someone's expectations. The road became his home, but it wasn't the comforting kind. It was a blur of motels, late-night meals, and endless rehearsals. And as the years rolled on, the line between passion and pressure began to blur. He loved the music, but the grind was relentless. For every standing ovation, there were nights when exhaustion and doubt hit hard. Sometimes, between shows, he'd sit backstage, staring at his instrument, that same mandolin that once felt like magic, and feel nothing, just emptiness. But giving up wasn't an option. In his heart, he knew music wasn't just his career, it was his calling. Still, calling or not, the industry could be cruel. There were moments when he felt invisible, especially when traditional bluegrass started to fade from mainstream radio. Record executives began pushing for a modern sound. They wanted slicker production, less soul, more flash. Ricky was torn. To survive, he'd have to evolve. But could he do that without betraying the authenticity that made his music real? Those years were filled with conflict. On one hand, he wanted to protect the purity of bluegrass, the sound of his roots. On the other, he knew change was inevitable. The weight of expectation, from fans, from labels, from himself, pressed harder than ever. It was around this time that personal struggles began to mirror professional ones. The long stretches away from home strained relationships. Fatigue led to frustration. The joy that once came so naturally now had to be fought for. He faced health scares from overwork, emotional burnout from years of touring, and the creeping fear that the music industry he'd loved since childhood might crush the very spirit that created his art. But even in that darkness, Ricky found light through faith, family, and a quiet promise he made to himself. He wouldn't let the world change who he was. He began writing and playing not to please the industry, but to reconnect with why he started in the first place. Those nights alone in cheap motels became songwriting sessions. Those feelings of emptiness became melodies filled with longing. And soon, something began to shift. The boy from Kentucky who once played barefoot on porch steps was rediscovering his voice. Not the one molded by the industry, but the one born from struggle, honesty, and faith. The grind had nearly broken him. But it was that same pressure that forged the next phase of his journey. The moment when Ricky Skaggs would take control of his music, his career, and his life. And that turning point would come with a risk that few artists dared to take. It takes courage to start over when the world already thinks you've made it. By the early 1980s, Ricky Skaggs had built a respected name in country music. But deep inside, he knew something was missing. He was surrounded by success, yet haunted by the quiet voice that whispered he was drifting away from his roots. The Nashville scene was booming, but it was also ruthless. Artists were constantly being molded, reshaped, and repackaged. For Ricky, every song that didn't sound like him felt like a small betrayal. He didn't just want to sing, he wanted to mean every word. And so, he made a decision that many called career suicide. He was going to bring bluegrass, that raw, mountain-born sound, back to the mainstream. At a time when slick, polished country pop dominated the airwaves, Ricky wanted to do the opposite. He wanted fiddles, mandolins, harmonies that echoed the hills of Kentucky. The sound that had raised him. It wasn't an easy fight. Record labels were skeptical. Producers warned him that the audience had moved on, but Ricky didn't flinch. He knew that music built on honesty had power, even if it didn't fit the trend. And then it happened. The risk began to pay off. His 1981 album, Waitin' for the Sun to Shine, became a breakthrough, producing 2 number-1 hits and earning critical acclaim. The industry began to see what he saw all along, that authenticity could still move people. Suddenly, bluegrass wasn't old-fashioned anymore. It was real, and Ricky Skaggs was the man who brought it roaring back to life. But success didn't erase the scars from the years of struggle. If anything, it reminded him just how fragile it all was. Every hit song was built on years of pain. Every smile on stage carried the memory of loneliness and exhaustion. And though the crowds were bigger than ever, Ricky made sure the message behind his music stayed the same. That no matter how far you go, you can't forget where you came from. His faith became his anchor. His family became his refuge. And his music, once again, became his therapy. Through songs like Crying My Heart Out Over You and Heartbreak, he gave voice to the heartbreak and hope that defined not just his life, but the lives of everyone who'd ever fought to keep their dreams alive through hardship. Ricky's courage to return to his roots didn't just revive bluegrass, it revived him. It reminded the world that music with soul never dies. It reminded him that even the hardest paths can lead to purpose. The risk had paid off. But behind the success, new challenges were waiting. Ones that would test not his career, but his spirit. Because even after the world called him a legend, Ricky Skaggs still had to fight for peace in a life built on sound. Fame, for all its glory, casts a long shadow. And Ricky Skaggs, even after reclaiming his sound and reviving bluegrass, wasn't immune to the darkness that lurked behind the applause. Every night he walked onto a stage, the crowd saw the legend, the man who brought the mountains back to Nashville, the artist who could make a fiddle weep and a mandolin dance. But what they didn't see was the fatigue etched into his eyes after months on the road. They didn't hear the quiet doubts that still whispered when the lights dimmed. Because behind every triumphant chord was the price of perfection. Ricky had always demanded excellence from his band, from his recordings, and most of all, from himself. But that relentless pursuit came with a toll. Touring schedules blurred days into weeks, and the constant pressure to deliver hit after hit left little room for rest. As success grew, so did expectations. Labels wanted more albums, fans wanted more tours, and the industry wanted Ricky Skaggs to be everywhere at once. There were times he'd wake up in a hotel room, unsure what city he was in, his only anchor the next show on the calendar. And while his music was soaring, his spirit was growing weary. The lifestyle of constant travel and performance began to erode the balance he once held so dear. Family dinners turned into phone calls, milestones were missed, and moments of peace became rare. The man who once sang of love and home now spent most of his nights far away from both. Even worse, the very authenticity that had made him beloved became a source of pressure. Fans expected Ricky to stay the same, pure, traditional, unchanging. But the world around him was evolving. Country music was shifting again, leaning further into pop influences. New artists were rising, bringing flash and fame that didn't align with his quiet sincerity. In interviews, Ricky often smiled and spoke with humility. But behind those kind eyes was a man trying to reconcile his purpose. He'd fought so hard to make bluegrass matter again. But could he keep carrying that weight alone? Then came moments of doubt, the kind that every artist faces but few admit. Was he still relevant? Had the world moved on? Was the music he bled for still being heard the way he meant it to be? The late 1980s and early 1990s were a crossroads. Ricky faced creative burnout, exhaustion, and emotional strain. The same discipline that had once saved him now felt like a cage. He wasn't just performing songs anymore. He was surviving them. And yet, even in the shadow, a flicker of light remained. Through prayer, reflection, and time away from the spotlight, Ricky began to see that the struggles he faced weren't meant to destroy him. They were meant to deepen him. Every note of pain, every lonely hotel night, every doubt, all of it was refining him into something stronger, something truer. Because sometimes, before you can rise again, you have to face the parts of yourself that fame forced you to hide. And soon, Ricky Skaggs would find redemption, not on a stage, but in the quiet embrace of faith, family, and the music of the soul that had been calling him home all along. When the applause fades and the lights go dark, what's left is the truth. For Ricky Skaggs, that truth came in the form of faith, a force that would guide him through his lowest moments and lead him back to the peace he had been searching for. After years of relentless touring and chasing perfection, Ricky began to step back and reassess what really mattered. The fame, the awards, the hit songs, they were blessings, yes, but they weren't the foundation of who he was. Deep down, he realized that music was never just about fame or recognition. It was about spirit, a divine language that connected his soul to something greater. Faith wasn't new to him. It had been there since those early church gatherings in Kentucky, when gospel songs filled the air and music was more prayer than performance. But somewhere along the way, the noise of success had drowned that quiet voice. Now it was calling him again, gently, persistently, asking him to return to what was real. That calling led Ricky to rededicate his life not just to music, but to the message behind it. He started incorporating gospel influences into his performances, not as a commercial move, but as a reflection of his heart. He spoke more openly about his Christian faith, his gratitude, and the grace that carried him through the storms. His family became his sanctuary. His wife, Sharon White, herself a gifted singer, became both his partner in life and in harmony. Together, they found healing through shared music, songs that spoke of love, forgiveness, and resilience. Performing alongside her, Ricky rediscovered the joy of music without the burden of pressure. Every harmony they sang together was a reminder that the truest melodies are born from unity, not ambition. Through this renewed perspective, Ricky began to evolve again, not as a commercial artist chasing trends, but as a man reclaiming his peace. He shifted focus toward bluegrass gospel and acoustic projects, returning to smaller venues and intimate performances where he could feel the audience's heartbeat again. He wanted connection, not spectacle, meaning, not metrics. Critics called this phase the rebirth of Ricky Skaggs, but he would tell you it was more than that. It was redemption. The years of pain and struggle had stripped away everything unessential, leaving only the core of who he was. A man of faith, a husband, a father, and a storyteller. Through albums like Soldier of the Cross and Mosaic, he poured his renewed spirit into every lyric, blending bluegrass with gospel to create something profoundly human. His music once again carried that sacred balance between sorrow and hope, the sound of a man who had walked through the storm and come out with gratitude. And perhaps that's what made his legacy endure. Ricky Skaggs didn't just preserve bluegrass, he proved that authenticity never goes out of style, that faith can guide even the most tired soul home, and that music born from truth can heal not just the artist, but everyone who listens. The boy from Kentucky, who once strummed a mandolin under the stars, had come full circle, not just as an artist, but as a man who found peace where it all began, in faith, family, and the unbreakable power of a song. By the time Ricky Skaggs reached the later chapters of his career, something remarkable had happened. The very sound he once fought to defend had found its way back into the mainstream conversation. Young artists, inspired by his purity and precision, began picking up the mandolin again. The echoes of bluegrass were no longer fading. They were thriving in new hands, and much of that revival traced straight back to Ricky's persistence. It's poetic, really. The man who once felt left behind by the changing tides of country music became the anchor for a generation seeking something real. Ricky's influence stretched far beyond his chart hits or Grammy Awards. It lived in the quiet revival of tradition, in the way artists like Chris Thile, Alison Krauss, and Sierra Hull carried forward the flame of acoustic authenticity. Many of them credit Ricky as their compass. The artist who proved that staying true to your roots doesn't mean getting stuck in the past. But Ricky's legacy isn't just about music, it's about conviction. He taught that success means nothing if you lose the essence of what made you start. Every story he told through his songs, every note he played, came from a place of deep truth. That's why his music aged so gracefully, because it was built on sincerity, not on fleeting trends. Even now, when you hear those piercing harmonies and that mandolin slicing through a bluegrass tune, there's something familiar, something spiritual. It's as if Ricky Skaggs imprinted a piece of his soul into the very DNA of American roots music. And yet, for all his accomplishments, Ricky never carried himself like a man obsessed with legacy. He often said his mission wasn't to be remembered. It was to serve the music, to honor the gift God gave him, and to leave the world a little more in tune than he found it. That humility became part of his legend too. Behind the scenes, Ricky poured energy into mentoring younger musicians, sharing wisdom that came not from fame, but from faith and experience. He reminded them that the music business can strip away your joy if you let it, and that true fulfillment doesn't come from applause, but from alignment. When what you do on stage matches who you are off it. He also used his platform to preserve bluegrass history. Whether it was producing traditional projects or performing with the Skaggs family band, he made sure the art form stayed alive, not as nostalgia, but as a living, breathing tradition. Even in his later years, Ricky refused to slow down. He still toured, still collaborated, still poured his heart into every note, and yet, his performances had shifted. They weren't about proving anything anymore. They were about gratitude. Every concert felt like a prayer in motion, a celebration of everything he'd endured and everything he'd overcome. Because in the end, Ricky Skaggs' true legacy isn't written in trophies or headlines. It's written in the quiet moments. The fans who found comfort in his songs, the young artists who found courage in his story, and the faith that guided him through every trial. And as the world continued to change, Ricky's music stood as a reminder. Authenticity might not always be the loudest voice in the room, but it's always the one that lasts the longest. When you strip away the awards, the accolades, and the decades of fame, what remains of Ricky Skaggs is the same simple truth that defined him from the start. A man with a mandolin, and a purpose. He never needed glittering lights to shine. What set Ricky apart was his ability to connect, not through spectacle, but through sincerity. Whether he was performing on the Grand Ole Opry stage or at a small-town church, his goal never changed: to make people feel something real. And maybe that's why, even now, his story resonates so deeply. Because behind the image of the bluegrass legend lies a man who faced heartbreak, self-doubt, and exhaustion, but never let those moments harden him. Instead, they softened him, shaped him, and gave his music a depth that only life can teach. Ricky often spoke about how fame can become a mirror that distorts who you are. Early in his career, that reflection was bright and flattering, but as the years went on, he learned to stop looking at it altogether. He began seeing himself not through the lens of public approval, but through the quiet conviction of purpose. And that's what makes his journey so human. He was never just a virtuoso musician or a genre pioneer. He was a man learning how to balance calling and contentment, ambition and peace. When he sings now, you can hear that balance in every word. The youthful fire is still there, but it's tempered with wisdom. The mandolin still dances, but it carries a weight of gratitude. His voice has mellowed, deepened, carrying the kind of soul that can only come from someone who's lived through the highs and lows and learned to embrace both. What's even more profound is how Ricky Skaggs measures success today. He doesn't chase relevance, he cultivates reverence. He focuses on faith, family, and the next generation, spending his days surrounded by the people and principles that ground him. He once said in an interview, "If I can make one person feel closer to God through my music, then I've done what I was meant to do." That sentence sums up his entire life's work. Every note, every lyric, every performance, all of it circles back to that mission. Even now, when young artists ask him how to make it, Ricky's advice isn't about marketing or management. It's about integrity. Find your voice, he tells them, then protect it, because that's what the world will try to take from you first. As the story of Ricky Skaggs continues, one thing remains clear. His music isn't just a soundtrack of his life, it's a testimony. It's proof that no matter how far fame takes you, there's no greater victory than returning to where it all began. Truth, tradition, and heart. In the end, Ricky's legacy isn't about bluegrass or country. It's about courage. The courage to stay grounded when the world changes around you. The courage to speak through strings when words fall short. And the courage to believe that even the quietest notes can echo forever. Because when the final song fades and silence fills the air, Ricky Skaggs' story reminds us that greatness isn't measured by how loud you play. It's measured by how deeply your music lives in the hearts of others. And for Ricky, that music will never fade off.